Cori has an amazing story to tell. She developed multiple sclerosis and, was progressively losing function until she realized, of course, that her condition was directly related to aspartame. She got off of aspartame, which is NutraSweet, and she really did ever so much better. Now, there are probably many causes certainly of multiple sclerosis, but certainly one of them is aspartame. And yet, of course, this deadly poison, and it is a poison, and it was known to be a poison by the Federal Drug Administration when they released it into the food supply back in 1981. It produces cancer, and it affects fertility, but it attacks the nervous system. It produces brain tumors. There are all sorts of difficulties with this, and the government knows it. And, of course, they persist in this, and they're concealing the truth from the American people. Well, Cori's put together two great videos, both of which are available from Radio Liberty. One is called Sweet Misery, the other called Sweet Remedy, and there really are amazing footage, especially I like them both, but Sweet Remedy actually has all sorts of footage with Dr. What was his name, that gentleman who did all that research so many years ago?
Well, there are a lot of doctors on there.
But you had the doctor, it starts with an O.
Dr. John Olney.
Dr. Olney, he was working...
He coined the term excitotoxicity and discovered that aspartic acid could cause holes in the brains of mice in the lab.
And, of course, they knew this back in the 1960s, 1970s.
Mm-hmm. And they sure did.
And because of his work, the FDA didn't refuse to release it for 15 years?
Yes, it took from 1965 when G.D. Searle released information about the discovery of aspartame in their lab to 1983 when it was approved for use in dry foods.
And, of course, then it's exploded, and they give it to our children, and they put it in all sorts of prepared foods. And what have you learned about aspartame and its toxic effects, Cori? Because, of course, you're pretty much an expert on it.
Well, there are, there's so many different things. There are 92 symptoms that were released by the FDA through a Freedom of Information Act of different symptoms that people have reported to them regarding the problems with aspartame, and a lot of them are neurological, so they are very vast and varied. Things like dizziness, thinking in a fog, memory loss, slurring of speech, and then into either mimicking or worsening diseases like fibromyalgia, Parkinson's disease, lupus, MS, ADD. There are a number of different things. There's confusion. There's headache is like the top one, which you wouldn't think is a very huge thing, but recently they came out with migraines maybe tied to brain damage.
Well, of course, the thing is that if this is really true, why have they released this to the American people, especially when there's definite proof, at least in animals, that produces cancers of the brain? And, of course, we see a dramatic increase in that over the last few years. We'll be right back. Well, Cori, why don't you go right ahead? And Sydney, why was this released? In other words, ordinarily you would think that the government's there to protect us from these harmful products, and isn't that what their function is, to protect the public?
Well, that ostensibly is their purpose, but like the attorney Jim Turner in Sweet Remedy says that he believes that these regulatory agencies are born captured, that they do not come into existence until industry needs them. I think, in a lot of ways it's a twofold thing, that they're not only lying to us in the form of PR and saying that aspartame is safe and things like that, but they're affecting our ability to discern that lie that they're telling us from the truth. And they're doing that by putting such excitotoxins in our food supply like aspartame and MSG, or fluoride in our water supply, or all these different food additives and so forth that cloud our thinking, that make us very sheep-like and able to just let it go and not really consider all of these things as terribly important. And so therefore they're able to get things passed that take away our freedoms. I really like the idea that you talk about on your site about regaining our freedoms, about finding a way to get our freedoms back and going back to a time when things were freer. I'd like to ask the audience if they remember a time in our past, perhaps as children or teenagers, even young adults, when we had a sense of clarity in our thoughts, when we were quick to find the right word for what we wish to express. Even as time goes on and our vocabulary increases and gets better, we seem to be into an encroaching fog. How many people out there slowly discover some difficulty in recalling one's important stories and observations, and then it drives me crazy to understand. Then once we sense we're watching something on television news that contradicts our basic sense of what we know, how many people simply let it go rather than attempt to recollect what we've learned exactly from and challenges what we're fed on television? We see these things on television and in the news media that are directly contradicting what we have learned in the past.
Hold that thought right there. Well, this is Archer Stan, and Cori has said that really she believes that these federal agencies like the Federal Drug Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency were really set up, of course, when industry needed them to cover for things that industry was doing that was really deleterious. And, of course, then when the lawsuits come, they can always say, well, the federal government actually said it was safe, and certainly if the federal government said it's safe, it's like fluoride. How could you possibly be critical, of the companies that manufacture fluoride and contaminate a farmland or injure people when the government allows this to be put into the water? How could it possibly be dangerous? And I would like to suggest that it's put in the water because it is dangerous, and that's the last thing they want the people to know. Wonderful fertility. I mean, do you ever wonder why we have so many cancers now back in the beginning of the 20th century? Why the incidence of cancer was 3 per 100 and now it's 50 per 100? Back many, many years ago, why certainly we didn't see all the people having difficulty with fertility. We didn't find the testosterone level dropping dramatically in men or the sperm count dropping dramatically. All of these things directly related to the fluoride, and the scientific studies show it, and we've got them all, Cindy and I, in our fluoride syllabus. With the scientific studies are there. But how many dentists have ever read the scientific studies? How many doctors who tell you fluoride is perfectly safe, and anybody who's concerned about it has to be some sort of a nut? And well, anybody, of course, who's concerned about aspartame, why the government would never release something that produces cancer and put it in our food that we're giving to our children, would they? And then we wonder why so many of our children are developing brain cancers and other types of cancers. Well, Cori, as you, of course, travel around the country talking to people, did you find many people who improved with these neurological diseases after they'd gotten off their aspartame?
Absolutely. I found that pretty much everybody I talked to got better after they got off of MS. After they got off of aspartame. And it wasn't just MS. It was people with brain tumors. It was who had difficulty with their memories as a result. It was people with lupus and fibromyalgia. All of these different things. Dr. Russell Blaylock had mentioned in our documentary how people can be improved once they stop these toxins. And a lot of times I believe that we're feeding our disease and our illness with toxins that help perpetuate the very disease that we're trying to curb we're not allowing our body to heal. Our body wants to heal itself, but if we're continually feeding it sludge and junk, then it's really making the job very difficult for it to do.
Well, we're seeing, of course, Parkinson's disease in younger and younger people. And, of course, a lot of them, of course, are going ahead and drinking all these soft drinks that are laden. We don't want to have anything fattening like sugar, so we're going to go ahead and put aspartame in them. And, of course, this is exactly what's producing the problems. We find all this talk about, obesity. Have you noticed all this talk on television about obesity, and they show us people with fat stomachs and, pathological obesity. The government's got to do something about it. Well,
it's been horrible. Severe obesity in this country has doubled, has had a 50% increase between 2000 and 2005. That's just 5 years. And that is just a nightmare to think about. When you look globally, you look at a country like Sweden, and in over 25-year time span, obesity rates have doubled there, too. Now, there was a 9% increase in France and a 12% increase in Germany. So all of these countries, Japan has been experiencing increases in obesity.
Do they allow aspartame in all those other countries, or is it just in America they allow it?
It's been rubber stamped throughout the world once it was approved for use through the FDA.
Now, my understanding is, of course, that when they were doing the initial studies on aspartame and aspartic acid, they found that it actually produced pathological obesity in animals. And certainly there's no reason if it produces pathological obesity in animals other than it wouldn't produce pathological obesity in human beings. Have there been any studies to show that it leads to pathological obesity in human beings? And what about animals? I've heard that when they're trying to fatten them up before they take them to slaughter, why they'll give them aspartame. Is there any truth to that?
From what I understand, they feed them MSG.
MSG, okay, that's another excitotoxin.
Yes, that reacts similarly in the brain, according to Dr. John Olney's studies, he studied both MSG. He along with attorney Jim Turner were critical for getting MSG out of baby food. And Dr. Olney went on to study aspartic acid, one of the breakdown components of aspartame, and found that it was doing the same thing as MSG. Dr. Blaylock mentions that there's a synergistic effect in people, so that when you have both, when you have MSG, let's say you have some MSG-laden food, and it's not only in Chinese food, by the way. It's in thousands and thousands of products, labeled everything from natural flavors to hydrolyzed vegetable protein to yeast extract. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit off the point. But it's both of those things can really create obesity, and they do act very similarly.
All right, fine. Sydney, as add the aspartame, to the products in the MSG, why, of course, it produces pathological obesity, and then the government comes along and says, gee, look at that pathological obesity, we're going to have to do all sorts of things to cut back on it. But the scientific studies were there. They were there back in 1981 when they released these products into the food chain, knowing full well what was going to happen. Now, what about the brain tumor? Would you like to talk about that? What were the studies in the animals as far as brain tumors were concerned, and what is the relationship to the marked increase in human brain tumors we've seen since aspartame was put in the food chain?
Well, there was a rise shortly after aspartame went on the market. Very recently, there was a Ramazzini study, it was called, from the Ramazzini Institute in Italy. Dr. Safridi looked at 1,800 rats in 2005, and he found a marked increase in lymphomas, leukemias, and brain tumors in those rats.
And those were the ones who were taking the aspartame, right?
Yeah, oh yes, thank you, Dr. Sim. They were the aspartame-fed rats.
And of course, there's reports have come out within the last week to 10 days about the relationship between aspartame and cancer. And yet, of course, we see all sorts of things on the headlines of the papers and reported in Time and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report at the same time. But they never report these things about the relationship between these food additives, specifically aspartame, NutraSweet, and MSG, and the cancer. And you wonder why they have access to the information. Why does the controlled media suppress this information unless, of course, they're not concerned about the fact that there are so many